So now we're going to look at the New World Order that emerged in the period between 1913 and 1921. So we're looking at only 8 years of history. But during this period of time, the world changed, and the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world drastically changed. And so in this short period of time, the realities of international politics changed dramatically. The realities of the international economic system changed dramatically. But many Americans really had not adjusted to this new perspective. And so in 1921, many American leaders were still looking at things and looking at the world in much the same way that they had in 1913. Now, let's start with 1913, where the United States had just emerged from the presidential election of 1912, which Woodrow Wilson won. And it was a four-way election. We won't go into that aspect of American domestic politics, but just suffice it to say that Woodrow Wilson was a progressive Democrat. He had a very idealistic view of the world. He had a very idealistic view of human nature in many ways, and a very optimistic view of his ability to spread the American form of democracy throughout the world, especially in Europe. Now, World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, and was basically between two major warring coalitions: the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and the Triple Alliance, which was Britain, France, and Russia. Most observers in the beginning were very optimistic about the ability of the war to come to an end quickly. They felt that modern technology, the use of motorized divisions and air warfare and bombardment and machine guns and so forth, would bring the war to an end very quickly. And of course that did not happen. What modern technology did was to really make warfare much more destructive, and trench warfare became the major form of warfare both in the eastern and western fronts. And so, what happened basically was that the war just dug in, especially in northern France. And so it dragged on for a long period of time, actually for 8 years, from 1914 to 1918. Germany was forced to sign an armistice. And so Germany's bid for dominance of Europe failed. And the Germans found that they were not completely, totally defeated, but they certainly were forced to sign a peace treaty and an armistice because they could no longer make war. And the result also was a revolution in Germany, an overthrow of the monarchy, and the establishment of a democratic republic, or at least an allegedly democratic republic in Germany called the Weimar Republic. Now, when the first Wilson really initially publicly stated that he wanted to stay out, he wanted to keep the United States out of war. So in 1914, most Americans felt that this was not our fight. But we wanted to maintain our commercial ties with Great Britain, and we wanted to trade with the British, and we wanted to sell them all kinds of things. But from the German point of view, the Americans were selling the British things that were not actually weapons, but would enable them to carry on a more lethal, deadly war against Germany. And so the German Navy, which by this time had developed the submarine, which was an entirely new form of combat, began to torpedo the vessels that were crossing the Atlantic. And inevitably, American ships were caught up in this German submarine campaign called the U-boat. U-boat, it means Unterseeboot in German. And so eventually, when the Germans attacked these transatlantic shipping, Americans were killed. And that increased the anger of Americans towards Germany. And so by 1917, when the Germans announced that they were just going to torpedo any vessel. They were going to use unrestricted submarine warfare against transatlantic shipping. Woodrow Wilson felt he had no choice but to go to war. So the Americans, the war that had begun in 1914, was joined by the Americans in 1917. Now, 1917 was a turning point year in World War I, because what happened was America entered the war and Russia dropped out, because in Russia there was a revolution. At first a liberal democratic revolution, but eventually it became a communist revolution. And the Russians signed a peace treaty with Germany, giving Germany a large strip of territory in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, of course, thousands of American troops began to arrive in France, and they really turned the tide. Germany had been greatly weakened. You know, the year 2016 marks the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, which was a horrific battle. One of the things that the British and French were able to do was to weaken Germany, to to kill a lot of German soldiers, to use up a lot of German resources, and this long drawn-out war made it increasingly difficult for Germany to sustain a battle. And then with the arrival of the Americans, of course, it really turned the tide. So Germany had no choice but to sign an armistice in November of 1918. Now, Germany was not occupied during World War I by the Allies, unlike World War II, which we will see was very different. So Germany wasn't occupied, and that sort of made a lot of Germans feel that they really hadn't lost the war. Woodrow Wilson went over to France and presided over the signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty and the creation of the League of Nations, which was Wilson's dream. The dream of Wilsonian democracy was an international order of nations. And so Wilson's 14 points were basically a set of ideals for international relations that he was hoping to achieve in the world. You know, open treaties, self-determination of peoples, to try to avoid another world war. And one of the major aspects of Wilson's 14 points, of course, was the League of Nations, which was, again, based on a lot of very idealistic ideas, which eventually were incorporated into international relations, but at this time it was ahead of its time. Most of the major powers of Europe joined the League of Nations, but the United States of America did not, because when the Senate, the United States Senate, came to ratify the League of Nations Treaty, which we had to do under our Constitution, there was a number of opposition. And so the Republican leaders of the Senate, to a certain extent on partisan grounds, opposed the League of Nations because Wilson was a Democrat, and the opposition leaders, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, were Republicans. They were known as the Irreconciliables because they refused to compromise on the League of Nations. And Wilson, for his part, refused to compromise on any aspect. The major sticking point was Article 10, which is described in your reading, and you should look at, which is the concept of collective security, which means that an attack against one is an attack against all. And the Irreconciliables objected to Article 10 on the grounds that it would commit the United States to a war, to fighting under the League of Nations without a declaration of war by the Congress, by the Senate, which they felt was unconstitutional. Now, Wilson could have amended the language and he could have compromised a little bit, but that was not in his nature. Wilson was a very stiff man who was very much like kind of a Protestant minister and very strict in his personal morality, and he just wouldn't compromise. Instead, he thought that he was going to take it to the American people, so in the summer of 1919, in the summer of 1919, he went around the country speaking in favor of the League of Nations Treaty. It was extremely strenuous. Wilson was in bad health, and finally in Nevada, after a long, lengthy speech, and all of his speeches, of course, were public, usually without the aid of a microphone, he suffered a stroke. and he had to be taken back to Washington, D.C., and he was essentially incapacitated. His wife, Edith, made a lot of decisions, executive decisions, for the president, and he basically could not even function. The White House couldn't function. And so the Senate defeated the League of Nations treaty, and we never joined. By 1921, the Republicans had won the White House again, taken back the White House from the Democrats. And the feeling generally was that from many Americans that we really didn't want to have anything more to do with Europe. That we'd gone over there, we'd helped the British and the French to, save Western Europe from German domination, and that was enough, and that they didn't want any more. There was a feeling of cynicism, disillusionment, that the war had been this horrible cost, and people questioned whether it was worth it. Now, just briefly about the Far East, the United States was getting more and more involved in China, in the Chinese Revolution. There was a revolution in 1911, and China adopted a democratic form of government, but there were other competing powers. The United States was primarily interested in economic investment in China, and but so was Japan. And so our principal rival in China was the rapidly expanding Japanese Empire. In Latin America, basically, there were three areas of U.S. involvement. One was in Mexico. There was a revolution in Mexico. And there was a revolution in Mexico, and the United States sided with certain forces in Mexico, and there was also a revolution in Cuba, and the Cubans broke away from Spain, and the United States American involvement in Spain rapidly increased. American involvement in Cuba rapidly increased, and laid the foundations for a lot of the present-day relationships. So Cuba also became more closely tied and came more closely under the influence of the United States, even though the Cubans won their independence against Spain. And the third area of American involvement was in Central America, especially in Panama. And Panama had originally been a part of the nation of Colombia, and largely under Theodore Roosevelt, Panama broke away and became an independent nation, largely under the protection of the United States, which was in the early 1900s constructing the Panama Canal. So American influence in Latin America was rapidly increasing. And so all throughout this period, the American involvement, which we have seen in Unit 2, began with the annexation of Hawaii. Throughout this period, America became increasingly a global power. But Americans didn't quite know what to do with this new global dominance. And they really didn't have a clear idea, even in the levels of government, of having an American foreign policy. We had a foreign policy in Latin America. We knew what we wanted to do there, which was basically domination. We had a certain amount of influence in foreign policy in China, and that was really to counter Japan. But for the rest of the world, America really had no clear foreign policy. And so, as we shall see in the next unit, American economic interests rapidly expanded, but it was involvement without commitment. So we became economically involved in Europe, especially in terms of investments and trade and commerce, but we really didn't have a clear vision of the kind of Europe we wanted to see. So now we're going to see at the end of this, the important thing to remember is by 1921, the world of 1921 was very different from the world of 1913. Now in the next unit, we're going to look at the world of the 1920s.